MER Chandigarh. We can commence the session as it's 10 a.m. already. I hope the participants are ready for it. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. So the plan is basically to understand what is this entity called pharmaceutical economics. Why do we need to do it? Second, how is it usually done? And third, what is the utility of doing it? How do doctors, policymakers, economists use the way pharmaceutical economics is done? The way I want to illustrate this is through a recent paper of mine, which is basically on antibiotic resistance and what has happened with the discovery of the NDM1 superbug in India. The reason I'm using this paper to discuss about pharmaceutical economics is because it's a live demonstration of the fact as to on the various issues that we care about as a broader pharma or health economy. So let me share my screen and go from there. One second. Can you?
He's trying to share his slides.
Yeah. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So this is joint work with my colleague Anindya Chakrabarti, who is a faculty here at IIM Ahmedabad, and a doctoral student Mayank Agarwal. This is paper is titled, and it's a working paper, so your feedback is also appreciated. The paper is titled "Science, Pathogenic Outbreak, and Market Structure," and we basically use the situation of discovery of the NDM1 superbug and look at what its effect is on the way the market is structured in Indian antibiotic sales. Um, so there are three strands of literature we are caring about in this particular paper. One is on science and market structure. So basically, there's a lot of discussion in pharma economics that, well, when the market expands, like for example, right now there's a lot of push on COVID-19, all kinds of products, right? From testing kits to PPEs to therapeutics to vaccines. So there's a literature there of a pretty, I would say, 20, 30-year vintage, which looks at how innovation and science responds to as markets open up for certain diseases. And that, however, has not explored the direction of causality in the other way, which is, can science open up new markets? And this is what we try to understand, or change the structure of new existing markets. This is what we try to understand in this particular paper. Could science impact market structure? The case study we investigate is this case study of antibiotics market in India. We knew that we probably all know now, this is a medical audience, that Lancet Infectious Diseases published this article of discovery of this bug in a bunch of patients across Pakistan and UK and also India. And because once this was published in LID, there was a lot of media who and cry as well. And the question was, we wanted to see whether that had an impact on the way firms were selling medicines in antibiotics class in India at that point in time. So the other thing that is interesting in this paper is we don't know, for example, right now in the COVID situation, that where exactly has this outbreak come from? I mean, there are a lot of hypotheses floating around that there could be a zoonotic spread from a wet market, there could be a super spreader event, or there could be that this could have come from a bioterrorism kind of intention, etc., etc. But nobody has been able to put a finger on exactly where is it coming from, and research is emanating on that. Now, towards that, it's interesting. There's a database in Germany called the Berlin Outbreak Database, which basically documents scientific publications across pathogenic outbreaks over time. And even in that database, even if you are systematically documenting publications, there seems to be a huge information problem. So if you search there by Zika or Ebola, you will not be able to find scientific publications, let's say, that is doing a study on patients in Africa, etc. Especially for the recent pathogens, the evidence is a little patchy. So one wonders, in this world where over the last 4 or 5 months, a lot of preprints have come out in the medical literature space, what exactly is the role of science in all of this information problem that is there? So we want to also attend or contribute in that kind of a literature. The third reason why this paper is super important, I think, is, and also attends to the larger question of pharmaceutical economics, is that we all know that in the 1918 Spanish flu influenza situation, a lot of subsequent bacterial infections happened and deaths were because of non-availability of antibiotics. And already there is a lot of discussion happening now that antibiotic resistance in India and many parts of the world could be a problematic issue if there are subsequent waves of COVID-19. In fact, in a separate thread, Anthony Fauci has said that, well, we have had only 1 or 2 new antibiotics and this is an ongoing problem and we have to somehow fix it. We have to have new antibiotics in the system. The problem is that there is strong resistance, and having continual pipeline of new antibiotics has been a big challenge. So this is one strand of the literature where this paper attends to. The second is the question of, as an economist, as a pharma economist, we want to care not just about what is happening to the environment, but how what is happening to the environment translates into impacts on the market structure. What do you mean by market structure? Well, how are firms responding to it? Companies responding to it. In economics, we call them as firms. So I'll continue to use the word firms throughout my presentation. Now, what we test in this particular study is with the NDM1 outbreak, where there are different incentives and responses from multinational and domestic firms. Other studies could explore this in different other ways, but this is what we try to test in this. So ignore the text over here, and I'm going to share all the slides also later on as a PDF. So just ignore all the text, but basically the second strand of the literature where we contribute with this paper is understanding how market participants, the companies, are heterogeneously responding to this external shock that has happened. And the last thing, of course, is the bigger question of how we get more antibiotics, because the big issue is that there's a Red Queen effect. If you have lots of antibiotics, there's a clinical externality issue where you can actually generate more resistance. But at the same time, you also have to give antibiotic manufacturers the incentives from the market, that there's a large market out there, right? So there's a big issue of this Red Queen effect in antibiotic resistance. We have been running out as a society globally and locally in terms of active antibiotics. Johnson & Johnson recently launched a big program in R&D to do this from Europe. So this is a big issue, public policy issue. And in that context, we have this small case study where we have data to show that things change differentially for different types of companies. Once there was this exogenous shock from a scientific publication that happened actually in India. Right, so our shock, all of us are aware of this. There was this paper by Kumaraswamy et al. In 2010. They talked about how carbapenem resistance is rising with the NDM1 bug. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I've already said everything else about this. Let me just jump into some, so I'm going to skip all of this stuff. Let me just jump into, we also probably know as a medical audience what the situation is in antibiotic resistance in India, right? Even before in the pre-COVID era and all that. So I'm going to not belabor on that. I'm just going to run straight into this graph, which shows how the NDM1 bug has now emanated from India, but has spread around the world. It's there in more than 70 plus countries. It's a big public health, global health and public health issue. And that is something that I wanted to highlight quickly. What do we do in this paper? So what we do in this paper, and this is an interesting slide, and we'll tell you how pharma economists think about experimental design. So in the lab setting, when we are evaluating the causal effect of a drug or a new kit or anything, what we basically do is we get ethics approval. We have a design for a treatment group, and we have a control group. We look at what should be the power of the experiment, get the ethics approval, and roll out the experiment. And then my understanding, and I may be wrong, but basically the point is that we have different endpoints which start studying patients in terms of their responses on various endpoints. That's exactly what we are doing in all these, let's say, RCT studies with the vaccines that are now coming out with COVID-19. How do pharma economists do designs? So the way we do it is, okay, we look for interesting natural experiments which are potentially exogenous to what is there in the system. So for example, in this case, our experiment is this unintended sudden shock that has come from the publication of the NDM. In some other cases, in my other research, we have used of other shocks. Like for example, suddenly a celebrity has talked about or owned a disease, and that has destigmatized the disease. It may have an effect on the demand for a certain type of medicine in comparison to other type of medicine. Somebody wrote to me yesterday that they are working on price controls for cancer medicines from AIIMS Delhi. That's another interesting exogenous shock we also use often in pharmaceutical economic study. And with that exogenous study, we are then trying to find out, given the details of the way in which the shock pans out, which is the ideal treated market in the medicines context, for example, and which is the ideal control group. So for example, Lancet Infectious Disease talks that there is carbapenem resistance arising. And we know that a good control group would be other types of broad spectrum antibiotics or narrow spectrum antibiotics or some combination of both. So basically that's what we try to do here, which is that we have a treated group of these carbapenems on whom this shock would be potentially negatively incident. And even within them, probably domestic companies and multinational companies would respond differentially. And then there would be a control group of all other antibiotics. Hopefully there the story would be different once there is this NDM1 publication out in the market. And that's basically the way we are planning out setting up the design of this particular experiment. The second thing we do is I'm still now talking about markets, how companies behave, but obviously company behavior is predicated on how physicians are prescribing medicines, right? A lot of you are doctors. The company can come and detail the drugs with you, may or may not believe the scientific evidence that is there out on carbapenems, even if there is a Lancet Infectious Disease publication. That has an effect on the kind of prescriptions you're writing. So that is the secondary database that we use, which is a novel data set of physician RX behaviors. And we are able to document that as multinationals actually pull out carbapenems from the market, you can see that in physician RX as well, there is a negative effect. Physicians are writing more conservatively. They're becoming more defensive in their prescription behavior for carbapenems. So these are the two broad level results that we have in this study, and I'm going to show you how we do this econometrically. But that's how we are setting up the research design, and this is how we essentially do pharmaceutical economics 101 basically in the real world. So let me just give you some quick descriptive evidence. When the superbug and NDM1 started, it was published, this is how we see that Google searches panned out. You will see that in the period from April 07 to August 2010, there was a secular increase in the search for superbugs in India. Nothing there around NDM1. But just around the time when NDM1 paper was published in Lancet, there is the NDM1 line, which is the dash line, spikes, and the red line also spikes. So basically, the ecosystem started responding to this publication, and the fact that, well, carbapenem, which is the last line of antibiotics and the antibiotics of last resort, now are potentially going to be problematic to administer to patients. So our two sources of data, as I told you already, is using this shock that has happened with the superbug and with the NDM1 searches and taking it to sales data where we observe how companies are selling molecules. And second, we take it to physician prescribing behavior, which is also available in the Indian context. And we look at how this is incident across different types of company behavior. By the way, these data are also used by policymakers. So if you go and talk to NPPA, the National Pharmaceutical Pricing Authority, they will be using these type of data to set the price floor in the discussions around price controls of medicines, etc. So from the industry side, a lot of people do know that these data sets exist in the market. And I'm happy to chat a little bit more about what this is in our Q&A section. So this is what we see in our data. There are two panels here. Both are basically measuring what has happened to multinational carbapenem sales over time. And what we see here is on the y-axis, the share of sales in terms of milligrams of carbapenem sold for multinationals within carbapenems and within narrow spectrum antibiotics. And on the right hand panel, we show here the revenue amount, the share in the revenue amount of multinationals in carbapenems and in narrow spectrums. And the event that has happened is around the 42nd month in our data set, where 0 is basically April 2007, close to 80 is basically October 2013 when the data has stopped for us. So what do we see? We basically see that there was a fall that was happening in the share of sales, whether it's measured by milligrams sold of multinational carbapenems or whether it's measured in terms of rupees. It was falling, but there was an even more dramatic fall after the red line event, which is after the NDM1 publication. In contrast, what we see is more or less gentle and secular increase in narrow spectrum antibiotic consumption sales in the market. And this basically gives us the intuition for a difference in different setting. What is the difference in different setting? So a difference in different setting is basically the first diff is the event pre and post Lancet publication, and the second diff is how things panned out in terms of company behavior or physician prescribing behavior in carbapenems and more broadly in antibiotics over time after the shock that we are examining. So then we take all of this. I'm not going to show you some econometric stuff. Basically, I'm just going to skip all of this and I'm going to go back to our bigger question of why pharmaceutical economics and discuss a little bit more. But basically what we see is that multinational share decreases in carbapenems, both in terms of absolute milligrams sold, in terms of money shares, and in terms of their prescription shares. This paper, by the way, I'm happy to share the draft of the paper as well if you want to read it. Alongside this, what they also started happening was multinationals started pushing less in the distribution chain. So in India, as you know, that multinationals give out to retailers some bonus quantity for the number of actual amount of drugs that are being sold in the market. And these are called channel incentives. So if you buy 100 strips of Cipla drug, then Cipla may say to the retailer that I can give you 5 extra strips for every 100 strips. But what we see in our data is that post the shock, multinationals started pushing less with such bonus quantity on an aggregate, controlling for everything else in very tightly controlled econometric regression models. This is a second mechanism we observe in the data. The other interesting thing we observe in the data is that not all multinationals responded universally to the carbapenem shock. And how do we test for that? Well, till 2010, we have like 21 multinationals. We can observe in Web of Science and in PubMed and in Scopus Cybers the number of scientific publications that are coming out by researchers from these multinationals. So basically, we create a variable that measures the scientific engagement of these 21 multinationals. Some are above the median, some are less than the median. And we see here that the ones who are more scientifically engaged are somewhat calm about this exogenous shock that has happened in the ecosystem. There is no effect on their sales share. There is no effect on their RX share, etc. It is the ones which are less scientifically engaged, which seems to have gone into a defensive, and they are the ones that are getting the largest share fall in the data. And finally, the last point here to be made is that this is happening more in the newer carbapenems than in the older carbapenems. Obviously, the newer carbapenems have, so there are 5 carbapenems in the data. The newer carbapenems have probably lesser efficacy and safety data. Doctors are a little more cautious prescribing them, and that gets picked up in our model in terms of the share decreases in the newer carbapenems. And then we do a bunch of robustness. We do a robustness with, oh, let's change the control. This should not be narrow spectrum antibiotics. This we change the control. We do some tests on showing causality more than just correlation. There is a interesting new tool that we are using now in econometrics, which is called synthetic controls. So instead of believing in researcher specified controls, let's create artificially matched control groups and see if results hold. The results are holding then. And if you want, in the AIOCD data, the sales data also gives you stuff around how things are being sold across different parts of India. So if you account for regional heterogeneity in the elasticity of the demand curve, even then the results are holding. So overall, that's what we find in the paper that we have. Now, going back, our agenda was to discuss pharmaceutical economics. And now I don't have any slides, but I just have some broader thoughts. Why do we do pharmaceutical economics? I think economics comes into pharmaceuticals and more broadly in the medical and healthcare context is to understand how is the demand curve looking like. The demand curve is supposed to slope downwards because as prices decrease, people demand more. It's for other products as much as for healthcare products. The supply side, the curve is supposed to slope upward as prices increase. Companies want to sell more, and there is an equilibrium point. So we want to use data to estimate demand, just like we tried here, to estimate supply, and then have a conversation on who is gaining out of the equilibrium effects of interactions between physicians and patients at one end and companies at another. Oftentimes we see that in pharmaceutical economics, oftentimes we see that there are exogenous shocks. These shocks can come from local regulatory pricing considerations, which results in price controls. It could come from science and technology. There's a new product introduced in the market, which shifts out the demand curves or shifts in the demand curve. There could be a product recall. A lot of adverse events are reported, like for example, COX-2 innovators suddenly had issues and Pfizer had to withdraw Vioxx and all that. So basically that market suddenly got negatively hit and demand curve would have shifted inwards then outwards for painkillers in that particular segment of the market. And these shocks that happened, in this case we had science as a shock, these shocks that happened changes the slope and the nature of the demand curve as well as the supply curve. And that helps us through like big data, we can estimate demand and supply curve. And that helps us in attending to the conversation on who is winning, for whom is out, towards whom are the gains going. Is it going to the physician and the patients, or is it going more to the companies, etc., etc. Now, what we don't do too much, at least I don't do too much yet, because I didn't have data like that to do it, is okay, maybe companies are winning. Maybe patients are consuming less of multinational carbapenems and more of domestic carbapenems. But ultimately, how can you translate this into mortality effects, right? So you want to ultimately care about whether there's an impact on patient outcomes. My data, unfortunately, till now hasn't been able to give me that. And I think that is the big challenge in doing pharmaceutical economics in a very holistic and comprehensive way in India. Because unlike in the US, from where I did my PhD, here we have all kinds of scattered data sets on let's say, patient medical record systems. First, it may not be available. Second, even if it is available, it is probably a private hospital system that has done all of that stuff and they are not willing to share the data. Third, we don't know what is the patient privacy aspect, regulation aspect of this in terms of how the data will be shared. So we don't see too much of data coming out from there. Recently, AIMS has started working with some Indian Statistical Institute economists on their outpatient medical database, but this is a very recent phenomena, for example. I wish that more of a systematic pan-national effort is there on documenting patient outcome databases across public and private hospital systems. And I'm sure PGI also maintains a long history, longitudinal panel here. So we could actually do a ton of stuff. I'm definitely sure that there's a lot of data out there. Some of it might be digitized, some of it might not be digitized. One can use OCR and other features to create such databases. But it's absolutely, the time has come for us to create these databases, sort out the regulation on the privacy aspect of patients, and explore how these demand data or supply data kind of stuff ultimately translates into patient welfare and healthcare outcomes. Because if we don't do that, we will still be like wishy-washy in our policy making. We will not be able to inform in a structural, steady state fashion what are the welfare and evidence-based policy implications of different types of shocks that the market keeps receiving. So that basically is the gist of what I wanted to convey to you. Why we do pharmaceutical economics is to understand the welfare implications of these shocks, whether it's coming from price controls, from tech innovation, from science, from company behavior, from product recalls to adverse events, etc., etc. Why? How do we do it? We use a lot of big data. We use a lot of physician prescription big data. These are starting to get available in India, but again, there is a big but. The big but is that you need to have money to buy this data. So there are like two sources of data providers on the industry side. They charge you a hell lot of money. But at the same time, we could actually work between public institutions like PGI and let's say IIM Ahmedabad to use our own data sources and use our own skills and competencies without having had to spend a lot of money to buy this data from these other private data set providers. And because that's how we basically want to, as I told you, look at the experimental design. That's basically how we do pharmaceutical economics. So we get into this big data and we want to understand the causal effects of shocks on treated and control groups over time, controlling for all else in the system. And the last thing is why we, so I mean, it's great you do all of this stuff, but how can you consume it? What's the utility of doing all of this stuff? And as I told you, I mean, so long as you can inform policymakers the health outcome effects of what's happening because of these shocks, I think policymaking can be more sensible and thoughtful and can help healthcare in India in the long run. So those are the thoughts, and I'm happy to now take some questions from all
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Chirantan, for a very thought-provoking presentation about how industry influences or gets influenced by some information which comes out of labs, and how people stop investing in certain drugs when they find that probably they are not going to be effective. But I really don't know what happened after 2010 or 2012, because I wish there was a microbiologist along with me from PGI, but we in infectious disease units, we treat patients with a lot of infections, and we find that this organism, this resistance of carbapenems to some of these New Delhi metalloprotein M1 resistant organisms, whether these organisms actually really lasted very long in our environment. And we know that there are now strains which are resistant, which are being treated with colistin, which was considered to be another reserve antibiotic after carbapenems like meropenem. But meropenem still is being used quite extensively in hospitals and mostly in bigger hospitals, of course, where the resistant organisms are there. So what I mean to say is that probably those steps which were taken at that time were more of knee-jerk reactions, as you said, like it was more of a shock which was received by the industry. So I think, as you said, the decisions need to become more evidence-based, and science needs to go hand in hand, or industry needs to go hand in hand with science as to what is coming out in consistently, from certain units. At that time also, when this bug was reported, there was a lot of hue and cry, at least in Delhi, in several microbiologist circles, and they felt that this probably was not absolutely correct. There was some demonstration of these organisms in, the waste waters. For example, now in the waste waters of West Bengal, they're even reporting resistance to cholesterol. So, that is like an organ, then that could be an organism which is totally pan-resistant to available antibiotics. So that is something which I feel is that we need to be more evidence-based and more scientifically oriented when we are making commercial kind of decisions, because they may be more consistently helpful. And secondly, now if we extrapolate this information which you have given about antibiotics to this COVID situation, this new pandemic which emerged, and several drugs, which were otherwise totally gone, like hydroxychloroquine and some of the drugs, we would use them in malaria also. They were not being used so much now because malaria was becoming resistant to these drugs. So they become like overnight, I think after Trump said that he's taking hydroxychloroquine or this is some wonder drug, India really sold quite a big stock of this drug to US. So I know that, these market decisions are based on certain unscientific kind of announcements, etc. also. But I think it's very important to be evidence because a lot of people started taking hydroxychloroquine, just like that will prevent occurrence of COVID infection in them. And what happened was that it had very serious side effects in cardiac patients because there were some deaths also which were reported. So then people became more careful that yes, the decisions need to be more scientific based, and then the guidelines appeared about how and when to use these medications. So these are some of the views which I have on this talk. We would like to take up any further questions. Harshit, if you could check if there are questions in the chat box, because
everyone is requested, either they can write their questions in the chat box or they can just unmute themselves and ask the questions.
I will. So Naveen has asked me whether I can share the paper. Yes, I will share the paper and the slides in PDF. This is under peer review. I just wanted to also mention that I have been presenting this paper over the last 2 months virtually with European audience. So I took it to a French group in University of Bordeaux and in Max Planck in Germany. Couple of interesting observations came out. One is that, okay, let's get into our database on patient outcomes and see whether the shock in India had an effect on how we were prescribing carbapenems. And in fact, a French doctor was telling me that he's seeing some effect. So maybe we'll see some studies coming out from there. We are talking about a potential collaboration. The other thing in the presentation that happened was somebody mentioned that there's a database which can look at how R&D dollars are being spent by pharmaceutical companies in antibiotics. So you can go into clinical trials data or pharmaceutical innovation type of databases and look at whether firms are moving away from carbapenems to newer type of antibiotic R&D dollars. And that is probably something that is also going to be explored. I mean, this goes back to the larger theme of we not just explore what is happening to the market as a pharma economist, but we also use shocks, whether it's price controls or this shock or COVID, to understand what is, let's say, happening in the upstream R&D segment on the industry side. Obviously, we know that like there are so many trials that are happening on vaccines around the world, given COVID. A similar kind of an examination also keeps happening in our set of the literature.
Good morning, sir.
You were the one talking.
I have a question regarding pharmaceutical R&D. Because in India, pharmaceutical companies spend very less amount in research and development as compared to production. Okay, their main focus is production, not research. So I want to know your take on this thing. That why companies spend less in research in India.
Because the incentives are not there to do research, I suppose. So India, as we know, historically has been the land of generic medicines, not just for local market, but for the world. Three things potentially resulted in that kind of an industry. One is we had the 1970 Patents Act that got reversed in 2005 with the stronger Patents Act from WTO TRIPS. But by then the economy, the ecosystem had generated a lot of entrepreneurs who are great in making generic drugs uh, out of reverse engineering patents and medicines from Western medical firms. Second is liberalization resulted in better export incentives for Indian pharmaceutical firms to go to other markets around the world, which may be a little relaxed about patents. So we had made good presence felt in Russia, in in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, etc. So exports formed an important component in the way incentive structure panned out and created our generic farm ecosystem. And lastly, when you do all of this year on year over 3-4 decades, you realize that, well, this is the lowest hanging fruit. I might as well do this. Why care about investing in the R&D dollars in a world where a new chemical entity first is going to take $2 billion to come out to the market? It is going to be highly risky. 1 in 10,000 compounds will result in a successful drug. Third, it will result in lot of patent tussles, let's say, with these Western medical firms. So when Zydus comes up with a Lipaglyn, then it has to fight in that therapeutic market category with Western medical firms on who owns the patent. So all of that is super costly and risky for like Indian firms to engage in. But I think things have changed in the last 10-15 years. Firms over time, having done a lot of reverse engineering, have developed scientific capabilities and are slowly, but I wish it was a little faster, but they are slowly getting into the science and R&D space. So there are a few firms there in that. So if you look at a Biocon or a Dr. Reddy's or even a Cipla or a Glenmark, in many different ways, they are trying to do some serious R&D. Sometimes it is internal R&D or even a Sun Pharmaceuticals, right? It has the Sun Pharmaceutical Advanced Research Center. All of these companies are trying to invest in R&D dollars in different strategic ways, either internal R&D dollars or go and acquire a Swiss biotech company or go and merge with some other company or form a scientific alliance with some startup in, let's say, the Israeli ecosystem, etc., etc. So all of these variation approaches and things are happening. Intas Pharmaceuticals in Ahmedabad, where I am, has a pretty decent presence in biosimilars, for example, if you're prescribing biosimilars. And hopefully they will also have a good presence in original biological molecules as well. So things have changed. Pace of change has been slow. Probably this is because the incentives locally and globally are like that. And once you realize that you have a comparative advantage in doing generics and biogenerics, let the rest of the world figure out their comparative advantage in R&D, and we might as well supply to the rest of the world cheaper medicines, right? That's basically the idea. And now wait, once the vaccines come out from whether it's a Zydus with Covaxin or whether it's from the Oxford study, just wait and watch what happens there as well in terms of the fights that will emerge between the Western firms and Indian firms. Serum Institute is already talking about pricing the vial at 1,000 rupees. Now, is 1,000 rupees the right price locally, globally? What kind of IP issues arise will start happening. So I think that's basically why I feel the R&D space is a little scant here. The last point I wanted to make is it's not just about companies. So if you look at the US ecosystem or even the European R&D ecosystem, huge investments historically by governments on the basic science R&D infrastructure in countries, especially those who have like strong presence in R&D, whether you go to Germany or UK or Japan or France or in US, you have a National Institute of Health, you have a National Science Foundation. And this is basically the post-World War II phenomena of investing in basic research. In India, we have not had too many of NCBS or too many of CCMBs of the world. We have been very applied in our thinking of basic research. We have not been structural and upstream in our thinking of, let's say, biology in how it helps pharmaceutical R&D. So as a result, a lot of the R&D capabilities we have in the basic research system is coming from chemistry, which helps generic manufacturers, but not as much biology manufacturers. It has been changing slowly in the last 10 years. National Institute of Biology, NIB, right, in Pune, NCBS, CCMB. These are some entities where things are happening, but it's few and far between. But basic research infrastructure is super, super critical, because that spills over in terms of science and R&D capabilities from the labs to the companies. And that's basically how you create the hotspots, whether it's in a Boston or a Tel Aviv or pick up the big hotspots of biopharmaceutical innovation. You will have this strong dialogue between public research labs and companies. We want to see more of that happening in India, spread across not just southern India in Bangalore and Hyderabad or Pune, but also across India, to really be important players in the R&D ecosystem.
Thank you very much.
Courtney Murali has asked a question. How are the pharma companies fixing the prices of vaccines and medicines for generic and branded ones in India? What are the factors making difference prices? So this is a bigger question. How do companies fix prices? I think the way they do it is a bunch of, it's a little bit of science and a little bit of art. So I teach a case on launch of a cancer drug by Biocon in India. And the case basically talks about the companies getting a sense from the ecosystem of what would be the physician and the patient willingness to pay. This willingness to pay feature can be teased out by running surveys with the ecosystem. When I say ecosystem, it means doctors. It means whether a patient potentially has some form of insurance or is it completely out of pocket. There could be a conversation on the side effects of the drugs. There could be a conversation on whether this is coming from a local company or from a global company. All of these are asked. You can ask, first of all, whether you will even have the drug or not, or the vaccine. And secondly, you can ask what should be the right price levels. And you can then estimate across a large sample how the willingness to pay pans out. You then bring it back into the strategy group within companies and decide with your data from the willingness to pay rolled out in the ecosystem. And potentially this is not just for India, this is going to be for the world as well. So you should have like strong regulatory data on both the manufacturing as well as the R&D and the clinical trial side on the evidence that is being generated on this medicine. And we can take it to other countries and open up export opportunities from these drugs and medicines. So those are my overall thoughts on how to make these new segments work overall.
I also feel, Chirantan, that we, some of our scientific agencies, for example, say ICMR or DST, DBT, we lack an interface with the industry. Somehow, whatever scientific findings are there, many times they are just lying in the files. They don't get translated into practical research, something which the pharma is looking for. So because there is a lack of interaction between the two, and in fact, there could be actually a commercial wing attached to these organizations. For example, ISRO had one, wing attached to their organization for doing commercial purposes. So what do you think?
Dr. Minu, at ICMR, we also have an innovation and technology division that is just acting that the kind of interface that you are talking about. I don't know how successful they are in their endeavors, but there is already this thought, and some people are already working on those leads which are coming out of ICMR research. So what I learned of late was that they went through all the final reports of ICMR funded studies to see wherever there was some translational potential, and they brought the industry into that dialogue, and they were trying to do something for the betterment. And this ITR division, they are already funding many innovators in India to bring out equipments and many other such things. So thank you, Dr. Chiranthan. You mentioned that GMP practices and strong regulatory mechanisms for Ayurvedic research, and also to create export opportunities for these companies to benefit. I remember during this pandemic, early in the pandemic, the Principal Secretary of Gujarat had already announced that 2 medicines would be given to all the population. They were of Ayurvedic nature. The 2 medicines, I don't recollect their names, but I don't know whether it was based on some research evidence or whether it was just from somewhere. But so we should, I think, being coming from India, we should promote our drugs and do whatever it takes to prove their efficacy in randomized controlled trials, and show to the world that yeah, these are the products that would work during the pandemic. Working on vaccines is fine, but there are, like Dr. Meenu said, Ramdev's product should also be evaluated for its efficacy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Anju. Dr. Anju is actually Senior Deputy Director General in ICMR headquarters, and it's really nice to have her with us today. I hope she keeps listening to the other talks also. Dr. Chiranthan, would you have any concluding remarks to make?
No, my main thing is that if we have to do proper pharmaceutical economics, we have to socialize the research data and not sit on it like we just said, both for policymakers as well as for industry. That is basically my overall. Otherwise, thank you very much for giving me an opportunity. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Chiranthan, for joining us from Ahmedabad. And with this, this session comes to an end. Thank you very much, and I hand you over to Dr. Noor now.
Thank you so much, sir, for a very informative session. Now we can move on to the next session, which is on measuring effectiveness, which includes estimating life expectancy, valuing health outcomes, and valuing quality of life. For this session, I would like to invite Dr. Gaurav Jani, who is a research scholar at School of Public Health, PGI MER, Chandigarh. Sir, we request you to please begin with your session.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I hope I'm audible to all.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I'm working with Dr. Shankar Pinja as a research officer in School of Public Health in PGI Chandigarh. And I'm also doing my PhD on valuation of health outcomes. So in this lecture, we will try to explore some of the related concepts, like how to measure health outcomes for the purpose of economic evaluation. And in this series of lectures, since yesterday, we have been discussing that with advancement of health technologies, newer ways are being made available with which we can improve the health of the population. But in order to use those advanced technologies, we need money. And when we need money, we have two options. We can do either of two things. Either we can raise our resources, which is not that easy. We have discussed yesterday also. Or what we can do, we can put our available resources to their best possible use, so that we can buy maximum health for the population out of the available resources, so that we can ensure best value for money. So this we have discussed yesterday, and this actually sets the tone for our subsequent lectures, in which we will try to explore some of the methodological aspects of economic evaluation, like how to do these things practically so that best value for money can be ensured. One aspect of this has already been discussed yesterday, that is related to measurement of cost. And in this lecture, we will try to learn about how we can quantify the outcomes, or how we can measure the effectiveness, or how we can value the consequences for the purpose of economic evaluation. So I hope you remember from our yesterday's discussion that in economic evaluation there are two arms. One arm relates to cost and one arm is related to effectiveness. So the costing part we have already discussed, and for the consequences part, now we will discuss that how these concepts can be used in order to value the outcomes for economic evaluation. And in the next lecture, we will try to club all these concepts together to illustrate that how we can do a full economic evaluation practically. So now in the interest of bandwidth, I'm switching off my video and sharing my presentation with you. I hope the screen is visible to you now.
No, sir.
Now it is, sir.
Okay, good, good.
हाँ बोलिए. Oh my God, ma'am, what a meeting now.
So in this lecture, we will try to understand how we can measure and value health for the purpose of economic evaluation. And I hope that at the end of this lecture, we will be able to explain that which type of outcome measures are most suitable for use in economic evaluations. At the same time, I hope that we can also provide a justified choice of health measures to evaluate the effectiveness and efficiency of a healthcare intervention. And we will also reflect upon some of the challenges of using existing health measures in new cultural settings, because we have been discussing that health economics is quite new to India. So some of these concepts are rooted in the Western way of thinking. But if we want to translate these measures in Indian context, what we need to do. So one by one, we will try to look at all these aspects. So this is just a recap slide. As you remember from our yesterday's discussion, that economic evaluation is a comparative analysis. And what do we compare? We compare both the cost as well as consequences. And we compare both these things for all the alternative interventions we are having in our hand. Like here you can see we have two programs, program A and program B. So if we implement program A, we will incur some cost, that is cost A, and some health effects will be produced, that is consequence A. Similarly, for program B, some costs are attached, that are cost B, and some consequences or health effects will be produced. So the cost part has been dealt with by Dr. Rajesh yesterday. So now we will be discussing consequences primarily. So as we know that the cost is always measured in terms of money, be it a preventive intervention, be it a therapeutic intervention. Suppose it is a preventive intervention like screening for cervical cancer. So we know that if we roll out a screening program for cervical cancer, we will incur a cost of some rupees, be it a therapeutic intervention like some stem cell transplant. Then also the measurement of cost will also be in rupees. But when we come to consequences, the story is not same. Unlike cost, there is no single unit in which consequences can be measured. So in economic evaluation, consequences can be measured in a number of ways. And how consequences are measured, that determines what type of economic evaluation this is. So this is also a recap slide. If you remember from our yesterday's discussion, that primarily there are three types of economic evaluations: cost effectiveness analysis, cost utility analysis, and cost benefit analysis. And for all these analysis, cost is always measured in terms of money. Wherever there are different endpoints in which consequences are measured. For example, in cost effectiveness analysis, consequences are measured in terms of some clinical endpoints. For example, if this is an antihypertensive drug, then the cost will be measured in terms of the amount of systolic BP it can lower down. Or for the purpose of cost effectiveness analysis, these consequences can also be measured in terms of mortality or deaths averted, or years of life gained, or some condition specific outcome measures, like if we distribute insecticide treated bed nets in the population, we can prevent malaria cases. So prevention of malaria cases, this can also be one consequence. So I hope you can now relate to the complexity which I'm trying to highlight, that in an economic evaluation, there are two arms. One is cost and one is consequence. Cost is always measured in terms of money or rupees, whereas there are different ways in which consequences can be measured. And how consequences are measured, that determines what type of economic evaluation it is. So for cost effectiveness analysis, these are some of the examples which we have just seen, that how consequences can be measured. But the problem is, like we discussed yesterday also, suppose you are in charge of a district. So now you are having a choice. Either you can establish new neonatal ICUs, or you can establish new dialysis centers. Now for both these interventions, outcomes are different. So just on the basis of a simple economic evaluation, which is of cost effectiveness type, we cannot make an informed decision, because we don't know that which one is better, which one is giving more value for money. Because on one hand, we are saving life of children, whereas on other hand, we are prolonging life of the ESRD patients. Now, right away, we cannot make a judgment that which one is better. So for that, the next type of analysis comes into picture, that is cost utility analysis, in which consequences are measured in terms of some utility based quality of life scales. I'm sure you have heard about terms like quality adjusted life years, QALYs, or disability adjusted life years, DALYs. So these are some utility based quality of life scales. So if we are measuring our consequences in terms of some utility based quality of life scales like QALYs or DALYs, it is a cost utility analysis. And what is the benefit of using cost utility analysis? Now suppose the same question comes in front of us, that whether we should invest in establishing new neonatal ICUs in our district, or whether we should invest in creating new dialysis units in our district. So if we know that investing in neonatal ICUs will result in 1000 QALYs gained, whereas if we invest in new dialysis units, we will gain 500 QALYs by investing same amount of money. So now our comparator is same, 1000 versus 500. So we can right away take the decision that we should invest our money in the intervention which is buying more QALYs, because now our comparator is same. So this is cost utility analysis. That's why cost utility analysis is preferred over cost effectiveness analysis. So yesterday also we discussed that there is sometimes the problem is at a bigger level. Suppose you are a finance minister and you have to decide that whether you should invest in health or education. Because if you invest in education, suppose there is an analysis which says that investing 1 crore in education will give you 10 crores, benefits worth 10 crores. Whereas if the finance minister asks health minister that what if I give you 1 crore rupees in health sector, what will be the outcome? Now, even if we are having our consequences valued in terms of QALYs or DALYs, but they will not solve the problem, because we cannot compare 10 crore benefit from education sector to 1000 QALYs generated because of neonatal ICUs. Now we will have to go one step further, and we will have to convert those 1000 QALYs into some money, so that we can say that if you give 1 crore rupee to health department, we will create new neonatal ICUs out of it, and we will create a money equivalent to rupees 15 or 20 crore. So that's how these things are taken into consideration, that what type of consequence we should use in order to do the economic evaluation. So I hope this has brought some clarity that what type of consequence is important and how these consequences are selected. So if you are working in the health department and you have to answer queries like whether you should invest in neonatal ICUs or dialysis units, you can simply restrict yourselves to cost utility analysis. Whereas to answer some problems at even higher level, you will have to do cost benefit analysis. So with this, we will try to move further. And in this slide, I try to mention that any measure of health is rooted in belief about what health is. So some of the arguments about health that are considered in different systems are presented here. Now forget about different systems of medicine. Even in modern medicine, you remember in our first year classes in physiology book, we used to define health in a different way. That what is the functional basis of the cellular health. In the second year in pathology classes, we used to define health in a different way. That what is the pathologic basis of diseases and how health is related to that. Now in medicine, we moved one step further. We tried to relate clinical manifestations to the health. So all these things, they actually depict different outcomes which should be measured, and therefore different systems tend to measure health differently. Now I would like to ask you that what are some of the health measures which come into your mind which you want to measure if you are doing an economic evaluation. Suppose you are trying to figure out that whether or not you should roll out an intervention in the population. So what are the type of health measures that you can think of that you should calculate? I hope my question is clear. Let us have a quick recap and let us look at this slide. For economic evaluation, we will have to measure both costs and consequences of all the alternative strategies which we are having. So for measurement of cost, we know that we will have to measure the rupees, the amount of rupees which are going in this intervention. But how we will measure the consequences? Can you think of any of the measures of health which we can use to define as an outcome measure in economic evaluations? I know it is little difficult to ensure such kind of participation in online classes. Anyhow, so one of the most used measure is mortality. That how many deaths will be averted if we roll out a particular type of intervention in the population. Or otherwise, mortality can also be measured in terms of number of life years gained because of rolling out a particular intervention. Likewise, for morbidity also, we can calculate prevalence and incidence, that whether or not there is any reduction in the prevalence or incidence. And even if there is a reduction, we can also quantify that reduction. So we can also measure consequences in terms of prevalence or incidence. But simply measuring the consequences in terms of reduced prevalence, reduced incidence, or reduced mortality does not solve our problem. So we try to use some disease specific measures so that we can get an exact idea that even if the prevalence or incidence of the disease is reduced, what the patients feel, how much improvement in their qualities is there, so that we can get an idea that whether or not we can invest in this particular intervention. For example, some disease specific quality of life measures are functional assessment of cancer therapy, which is used to calculate quality of life of cancer patients, or for asthmatic patients, we used adolescent asthma quality of life questionnaire. So these are some of the questionnaires which are there, which we use to measure quality of life. But these are disease specific. We cannot administer this cancer instrument in an asthmatic patient. Therefore, we have some generic measures also. So we have two types of generic measures: profile-based measures as well as index-based measures. One famous example of profile-based measure is WHO Quality of Life 100 questionnaire. And what are these profile-based measures? They are basically a graphical summary of each dimension of health which is being measured, like 50% reduction in pain, 20% reduction in mobility. We will get some kind of these kind of results if we administer these profile-based measures. But an improvement is index-based measures. And what they do, they tell us one number that is usually between 0 and 1 that summarize the relative value of several dimensions of health. Suppose there is a number 0.6 which tells you that if your quality of life is 0.6, you are 60% as healthy as compared to a perfectly healthy individual. So now it is an improvement over profile-based measure, because there you are having simply a graphical representation across various dimensions of health. But in index-based measures, we are having a single value. No matter what is the disease, that will tell you that as compared to a healthy individual, where do you stand because of this disease. So in order to calculate QALY or DELI, we use these disease specific measures or generic measures. So if we are doing a cost utility analysis, we will be using some disease specific or generic measures to value consequences. And if we are doing a cost benefit analysis, then what we need to do, we will have to value consequences also in terms of money. We will have to convert our QALYs or DELIs into money, and to convert this, we use two approaches: human capital approach and willingness to pay approach, that we will discuss in subsequent slides. So before moving forward, let us have a quick recap so that you can connect the lines. We are discussing how to do an economic evaluation, and specifically how to measure consequences for an economic evaluation. So in every economic evaluation, there are two arms: costs and consequences. For all the alternatives being studied, we will have to measure both costs as well as consequences. Cost we will always measure in terms of money, and consequences, there are these different types. And how do we measure this? We measure these consequences with the help of all these indicators. So there is a quick idea about what are the advantages and disadvantages of these disease specific and generic measures. As the name suggests, disease specific measures are only used in a particular disease. Suppose an instrument is there which is derived for asthmatic patient, it can only be administered in asthmatic patients. But what will be the advantage? Advantage will be it will make more clinical sense to interpret these results. It will be more relevant, results will be more relevant for the clinicians, and it is more responsive also. However, what is the disadvantage? It does not allow cross comparison. Suppose we are assessing quality of life of cervical cancer patients also, and on other hand cataract patients also. So if we are comparing QALYs of both these interventions, but we are calculating QALYs with different instruments, that comparability is questionable. So for the purpose of economic evaluation, it is always advisable to use generic instruments, because what they do, they yield a single index of value. that can be used in calculating QALYs, no matter what the intervention is. But obviously there is an inherent disadvantage that it will be less responsive to some clinically important changes in health, because some of the things that are very evident, some of the changes in the body which are very evident in cervical cancer may not be that evident in the cataract, and vice versa. So if we are administering the same instrument in both the patient, there are chances that we will miss out some of the dimensions which are not listed there in that instrument. Now in detail, you will get an understanding when we will discuss more about these instruments. So what these instruments basically try to do, they try to capture health of the individual. So some of the characteristics which are essential for an instrument, what are these characteristics? First, that the result of this should be comparable across different interventions and diseases. In other words, it should also capture quality of life of a malaria patient. It should also capture quality of life of a cataract patient, and it should also capture the quality of life of a cancer patient with equal efficiency. The second characteristic is that it should have interval scale properties. Now, what are these interval scale properties? That some measurable outcome should be there. Suppose there are different points on an instrument. These are 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So the difference between 20 and 30 should be equal to difference between 30 and 40. And why this is important? Because if there are no interval scale properties, responses would be like having disease and not having disease, or alive after treatment or dead after treatment. So this will not solve our problems, because we cannot calculate our QALYs or DELYs with the help of such kind of information. So it should also have some interval scale properties. Then it should reflect individual or public preferences, which means that you should administer the instrument directly in patients. There should not be a group of experts sitting in a room and deciding that cancer patients are having quality of life equal to 0.6 and cataract patients are having quality of life equals to 0.8. The instrument should directly capture the quality of life by eliciting the preferences of the patients. And it should also satisfy principles of psychometrics. Psychometrics means psychological measurement. Psycho means psychological and metrics means measurement. So principles like reliability. Reliability means it should have ability to produce consistent results every time it is administered. It should have valid. It should produce valid results. Which means that it measures what it intends to measure. Then it should be practical also. It should not have any ethical issues involved, and it should have a property of responsiveness also, which means that it should have ability to detect a clinically meaningful change so that we can calculate QALYs or DELYs transparently. So one such instrument which is most commonly used in economic evaluation is Eurocol 5 dimensions instrument, also known as EQ5D. So it has 5 dimensions, as you can see on your screen. They are mobility, self-care, usual activities, pain or discomfort, and anxiety or depression. So what are these dimensions? These dimensions are actually some aspects of health on which health change can be measured, can be manifested, so that we can measure it. So there are 5 primary areas in which EQ5D tries to capture the health change, so that we can ascertain the quality of life of the patient. And it is a generic instrument. No matter what the disease is, no matter which intervention you are studying, you can use this instrument to calculate QALYs or QALYs for your research. So with the help of these instruments, what we do, we calculate some summary measures. What are these summary measures? Summary measures tries to combine two things: the years of life lived as well as the quality of life lived during that time. So it actually tries to simultaneously describe morbidity and morbidity within a single number. So quality adjusted life year is number of years lived in perfect health, and disability adjusted life year is number of years lost due to ill health, disability of early death. So this is basically a definition, but if we try to understand the concept of QALYs and DALYs, these are basically flip sides of the same coin. In QALY, what we have gained because of having an intervention, that we measure. And in DALY, what we have lost because of not having an intervention, that we try to capture. So they are basically flip side of the same coin. However, it does not mean that they are interchangeable, because both can produce different results. That depends upon the age of onset of the disease which you are studying, the duration of the disease. So all these factors we need to keep in mind in order to decide that which summary measure we should use in our economic evaluation. So first we will discuss a little about QALYs. So as I have said earlier, that it tries to summarize two concepts in a single unit, that is in a single number, that is length of life and quality of life. And how it captures length of life? It captures survival. Suppose there is a treatment, suppose there is a stem cell transplant available for multiple myeloma patient, that increases the life of a multiple myeloma patient by 5 years. So the survival it offers is 5 years. However, suppose after having that treatment, the quality of life of the myeloma patient is 50% as compared to a perfectly healthy individual. In other words, the utility score of an individual is 0.5. So how many QALYs that patient will actually live? Survival multiplied by utility score or quality of life score. So survival is 5 years and utility score is 0.5. So although that patient will be alive for 5 years, but he will be living 2.5 QALYs. In other words, he will be living life equal to 2.5 years of perfect health. So that's how we calculate QALYs. So with this example, I tried to illustrate further how we calculate QALYs. You can see there are two interventions, A and B. A is colored in red and B in green. And on x-axis, you can see the survival benefit the intervention which the intervention offers. So as you can see, for A, the survival benefits offered is 5 years. And on y-axis, you can see utility level or utility score or quality of life score. Here 0 denotes death and 1 denotes perfect health. So suppose there is a treatment A. If we give treatment A to the patients will live up to 5 years. And for these 5 years, the quality of life of these patients will be 0.5. So actually, how many QALYs that patient will live? That patient will live 5 multiplied by 0.5. That is equal to 2.5 QALYs. So now we look at intervention B. So rather than giving treatment A, if we give treatment B, the patient will stay alive for 6 years. So there is one additional year of life that is offered because of intervention B. So in terms of life years, what is the benefit if we use intervention B upon A? It will offer us one more year of survival. However, in terms of QALYs, QALYs goes one step further. It will also try to capture the quality of life during those 6 years. Now, as you can see, the quality of life during first 3 years is 0.6. So by the end of 3 years, the patient would have lived 3 multiplied by 0.6 is equal to 1.8 QALYs. And from third to sixth year, in these 3 years, the patient would have lived, the quality of life of the patient is 0.7 for these 3 years. Third year onward, till the patient dies, the quality of life is equal to 0.7. So in these 3 years, how many QALYs does that patient live? That is 3 multiplied by 0.7. That is 2.1. So ultimately, in these 6 years, how many QALYs does that patient live? 2.1 plus 1.8. So that equals to 3.9 QALYs. And if you remember, in treatment A, the patient was living 2.5 QALYs, but now 3.9 QALYs are being lived by the patient. So simply, if we measure in terms of survival, there is a gain of 1 year only. But in terms of quality adjusted life year, the gain is actually 3.9 minus 2.5. That is 1.4. So in terms of perfect health, if we try to equate in terms of perfect health, if we use intervention B over A, it will give us 1.4 extra years of perfect health. That's how these QALY calculations are done. Now the question is that how do we calculate these utility levels? Who decides that a multiple myeloma patient having treatment A will have quality of life is equal to 0.5 and for treatment B 0.6 and 0.7? How we calculate that? So there are 3 techniques with which we can ascertain this: visual analog scale, time trade-off, and standard gamble. So visual analog scale is a very simple method, as you can see on the right side of your screen. It is a 20 centimeter long thermometer like scale where from 0 to 100 markings are there, and where 0 denotes the worst health that patient can imagine and 100 denotes the best health that the patient can imagine. And we simply ask the patient to rate his health on this scale. Suppose the patient says that today I am feeling that I will give 85 marks to my health as per this scale. So the quality of life of that patient will be 0.85. But it is a very simplistic measure. So we have another measure, a more sophisticated measure, that is time trade-off. And what we do in time trade-off, we give our patient alternative choices. Like suppose there is a diabetes patient, we will give him 2 choices. Either you live with diabetes for 10 years or you live in perfect health for 5 years. Now, which one will you choose? Now, depending upon all the experiences that patient is having with the disease, he will select one of the options. Let us assume that the patient has selected, no, 5 years is very less. 5 years of perfect health are very less as compared to 10 years of diabetic situation. I will still choose 10 years of diabetes. Then we will increase the time in the diabetes. We will say that, okay, 6 years in diabetes are better, or 6 years of perfect health are better, or 10 years in diabetes are better. Then suppose that patient still says that no, still 10 years is a substantially longer period. I don't want to sacrifice 4 years of my life just to get rid of diabetes. So we will further increase the time in the perfect health. We will say that, okay, 7 years in the perfect health versus 10 years in diabetes. Which one will you choose? Suppose he still says that, no, I will still choose diabetes. Then we keep on increasing the time in the perfect health till the point the patient says that, yes, now both options are equal for me. Suppose the patient at 8 years, the patient says that, now I'm indifferent. Whether you give me 8 years of perfect health or you give me 10 years in 10 years in diabetes, both options are equal for me. Then it means the quality of life score for that diabetes patient is 8 divided by 10. That is equal to 0.8. So with the help of time trade-off, that's how these calculations are done. Similarly, the last method is standard gamble. In standard gamble, we offer some choices to our patients. We will say that you have two options. In the option listed here, you will continue to live with the diabetes till your death. However, if you choose option A, we will give you a treatment. And that treatment has a possibility that will restore your full health. It has 70% possibility that it will restore your full health. However, there are 30% chances that a treatment will fail. And if the treatment fails, you would be dead. So are you willing to taking this gamble? Now, depending upon the experience of the patient with the disease, he will say, depending upon the severity of the disease, he will say that whether or not he would like to take this choice or not. For some very severe diseases, even if the chances of being dead are 40, 50 or 60%, the patient is so fed up with the disease, he will still say that, yes, I will take the gamble. However, for some very minor diseases, the patient will say that even if the probability of dying is 10%, I will not go with this. And how will we calculate our quality of life score based on this information? Suppose at this level, the patient says that, yes, now this certainty and gamble are equal for me. Whether or not I play this gamble, both the options are offering equal benefit to me in my eyes. Then the quality of life score of this patient is 70 divided by 100, that is 0.7. So these are three methods: visual analog scale, time trade-off, and standard gamble, which are used to derive these utility levels. And why we need these utility level? Because we want to calculate QALYs. And in order to calculate QALYs, we multiply the survival offered by that intervention with the quality of life score or utility score during that phase of disease. And how do we elicit this utility score? With the help of these three techniques: visual analog scale, time trade-off, and standard gamble. So in order to make the life of researchers easier, in PGI we are doing a countrywide study. We are actually developing a value set for the EQ5D, so that if you are doing your economic evaluation in India, you need not to do these visual analog scale, standard gamble, and time trade-off operations on your participants, because the participant is already in a disease state. So he may not be in the position to respond quickly, and it is a time-taking process also. So if you want to calculate QALYs, you simply record the health state of that individual on EQ5D based on 5 simple questions: that how are you feeling today with respect to mobility? Are you having no problems in walking about, or having slight problems, or moderate problems, or severe problems, or you are unable to walk about? And similarly for other dimensions of the instrument also. This will hardly take a minute or two, and then you will have a number like this, like you can see here, 11111. How do we arrive at this number? Suppose your patient says that I'm having no problem in any of these dimensions. So 1 in mobility, 1 in self-care, 1 in usual activity, 1 in pain and discomfort, and 1 in anxiety and depression. So you will get a 5-digit number, that is 11111. So this is a health state. That's all you need to do if you are doing an economic evaluation in India. Now, how to convert this particular health state in a utility score? That will be done with the help of the value set that we are preparing. So this is a multi-centric study. We tried to cover all the horizontal, all the cultural as well as the geographic centers of India, north, east, south, west. In this, 6 centers are involved, and more than 3,000 respondents have given their preference. And we hope to get the value set out by end of September this year, so that the measurement of consequences or the measurement of effectiveness for economic evaluation in India, that becomes easier. So that was the story of QALYs. What are QALYs? QALYs are basically 1 year of life in perfect health is equal to 1 QALY. Now the second summary measure is disability adjusted life years. That is 1 year of perfect health lost. As we have discussed earlier also, that they are flip sides of the coin. In QALY we measure what we have gained because of having an intervention, whereas in DELYs we measure what we have lost because of not having an intervention. So that is basically DELY. And now we will discuss a little about DELYs also. So DELY is actually a product of 2 things: years of life lost plus years lived with disability. And how we calculate years of life lost? The number of deaths multiplied by life expectancy at the age of death in that year. So number of years of life lost in population because of that disease, that we will get. Now we add in this years lived with disability. And how do we calculate years lived with disability? We simply multiply the prevalence of that disease in population with the disability weight. And what is this disability weight for Delhi? Disability weight is an index measure between 0 and 1, where 0 denotes perfect health and 1 denotes death. Now try to analyze this in contrast with calculation of QALYs. There we were simply multiplying survival with utility score, and for utility score that was an index measure where 0 means death and 1 means perfect health. But for DELYs it is inverse. Here 0 disability weight means there is no disability, the person is in perfect health, whereas 1 is, if disability weight is equal to 1, it means death. So with the help of this disability weight, we calculate years lived with disease in population by multiplying this disability weight with the prevalence of that disease. And also we calculate years of life lost because of that disease. We multiply the number of deaths with life expectancy at the age of death in years. So that's how we calculate DELYs. And as you can see, some of the disability weights are displayed here. Now, as you can relate, the severe the problem, the more is the disability weight. For example, there is 0.81 for terminal stage cancer, but for diabetes mellitus cases uncomplicated, there is only 0.01. So that's how these disability weights represent the kind of decrement in the health that a person is having. And how these disability weights are calculated? Actually, the preferences were reported, and these preferences were then adjusted for age and time preference. So now a little recap what we have discussed so far. We have discussed that if we want to measure consequences for the purpose of economic evaluation, we can measure mortality, reduction in the mortality because of the intervention, reduction in the morbidity. However, this information will not suffice if we want to do cost utility analysis, or if we want to transparently compare the available alternatives in front of us. So we need to resort to some of the other measures. So some are disease specific measures and some are generic measures. Disease specific measures are not recommended because they will not solve the problem of comparability. So we need to resort to generic measures. Generic measures are also of two types, profile based and index based. But profile based measures will give us only graphical representation. That will still not solve the problem. Indexed based measures like EQ5D, they will give us a value between 0 and 1 that describes the health of the patient. So this is what we have discussed so far. Now, if you remember, for cost benefit analysis, we need to convert our QALYs or DELYs or the gain in the health in terms of rupees. How we can convert health into monetary terms? So there are two approaches primarily: human capital approach and willingness to pay approach. Human capital approach is a oversimplistic way. It simply multiplies the years of perfect life gained because of that intervention multiplied by annual productivity. For example, if you are studying some disease in India, suppose that intervention imparts 10 QALYs to the patient, whosoever is taking the intervention, and annual productivity of an average Indian is equal to the net national income, or the per capita GDP of the India. Because what is per capita GDP? Actually, it reflects how much in monetary terms, how much a person produces in 1 year. So suppose because of an intervention, a person is getting 10 QALYs, which means he is getting 10 years of perfect life. And if we multiply this with annual productivity, that is per capita GDP, that is somewhere around 1,50,000 rupees per year for India. So the net monetary benefit because of that intervention will be 10 multiplied by 1,50,000 is equal to 15 lakh rupees. So that's how we convert our QALYs or DELYs into monetary terms with the help of human capital approach. But as you can see, this is a very simplistic way of converting. So the next approach is willingness to pay approach. Now, in order to assess the willingness to pay from our patients, we need to do a survey. Suppose we have a diabetic population and we need to assess their willingness to pay. We will first ask them that what price will you currently pay in order to get rid of diabetes. Suppose someone says that I will pay maybe 1 lakh rupees. Then we will slightly increase this amount. We will make it 1,50,000 and we will ask that would you pay 1,50,000 for this? Now, if he responds that yes, I will pay that also, now we will again increase the price. Or if he will say that no, I will not pay 1,50,000 rupees, then we will slightly lower the price. We will say that okay, 1,25,000. So it is like kind of bargaining with the patient. It all depends on the purchasing power of the patient. Ultimately, we settle down on the highest price that the patient wants to pay in order to get rid of that situation. Now that's how we, so it is a little more specific, although this is also a crude method, but it is very difficult to convert health into money. So these are some of the approaches that we kind of resort to in economic evaluations. And as you can sense that there are certain issues with valuation of health. For willingness to pay, it is heavily influenced by the purchasing power of the individual. For quality calculations, people say that it is inequitable for elderly, because if you remember in quality calculations, what do? We multiply survival with quality of life. For elderly patient, survival already is very less. So for our geriatric interventions, the QALY gains will always be reflected very less as compared to interventions which are working on children. So that's why there are some problems with the QALY also. And for Delhi also, actually the age weighting and the social preference weighting which we do while deriving the disability weight, that invites a lot of criticism, because the implicit assumption in deriving disability weights is that health of the young population or the more productive population is given more value. So does that mean that health of young adults and non-disabled is more valuable for the society? Does value of health decrease over time? Because what we do some kind of age weighting for that, for the benefits that we will be getting after 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, that are valued less than the benefits we will be immediately getting. So the calculation of disability weights invites a lot of criticism on how Delhi's are measured. Moreover, whose judgment is this? Actually, there is a group of experts that models the disability weight for different situations. So that also invites criticism. So every way of measuring effectiveness has its own pros and cons that we need to take into account. So although it is very difficult to summarize all these things in 45 minutes, so on our website, I invite you to visit our website, that is healtheconomics.pgsph.in. There are some free online courses available on which on these courses, each of these aspects are dealt in detail. So this was all from my side today. If you have any questions or comments, then please ask.
Economics.pgsph. Thank you, Gaurav, for really nice talk, because the way you took everybody along step by step is really very, very satisfying. I mean, even I could understand these concepts, so didn't want to leave it. It was extremely useful, I think. And I think if one understands the concept of DALI and QALY and how to calculate them and how to convert them into monetary terms, then I think one milestone covered in making an economic evaluation for any healthcare interventions. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am, definitely.
So, I think there are some questions. One is that a lot of people want your presentation, which was very good. But the way you took people along, first 3 steps and then come back to that particular step is something which is very, very helpful, I think. It's one of the teaching technologies, which people learn over the years. And these are difficult concepts. Yesterday, we had these comments that these were difficult concepts and they were covered in a very short period of time. So it was difficult to understand. So I think today things have become much clearer. So I think we will take up questions. It's mainly a lot of compliments you are getting, like great talk and thank you for a wonderful talk, insightful presentation. So I think you can add those marks to your presentation. And I think a lot of people will visit. There was a question from Dr. Nipun Verma. In a RCT on 2 interventions, do you calculate QALY per patient? How do you assess the time varying quality utility score in a patient? Time varying utility score in a patient. And I had a similar question, when you gave the example of setting up neonatal intensive care units versus dialysis centers.
Yes. Yes.
In units, of course, the number of years added would be much longer.
Yes.
But they will become useful, like something who is able to add value to that time. That will be only after 25 years.
Yes, ma'am.
Till that time, they will need investment. And
Exactly.
in adults with renal failure, they may already be in a state that they are useful. They are useful citizens and they're earning money, and so that way I think with varying time your value also will change of the number
ma'am.
of years which are there. So it varies over a period of time. So even in
Yes,
a disease, you know, when a disease is controlled and when a disease is not controlled, you
Hmm.
cannot just give a score of 0.1 to diabetes. If it is
Yes, ma'am.
uncontrolled with renal failure, then of course it will have a much lower value
Yes,
added.
ma'am. Exactly.
So I think that insight is very important to
Yes.
this particular disease. Dr.
So,
Anju, yeah.
yeah, thank you, Dr. Gaurav Vyani. This was very informative, and also easy to understand the way you presented. Thank you for that. So I wanted to know if there is a quality of life instrument for the pediatric population, like EQ5D, which you explained.
Yes.
Supposing we are doing a trial on, newborn infants.
Yes.
Is there some?
Yes, ma'am. Actually, EQ5D, the Europol group also publishes the child version of the EQ5D, and they name it as EQ5DY. Y stands for young population.
Okay.
So you can use that instrument.
Okay.
There are some disease-specific instruments also, like PEDS-QOL, that is used in pediatrics. But if you are doing an economic evaluation, then it is recommended that you resort to EQ5D only, so that the results of your study, the query calculations of your study, then can be directly
Comparable.
compared with other
Others.
interventions.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Extending to visit our medical school and hospital. Okay. So I think there was only one question, which is in a 6 months behavioral intervention for undernutrition among older adults. How can we include economic evaluation where the outcome measures are health-related quality of life and morbidity?
Yes. So we need to combine both these aspects, and I think in the next presentation, Mr. Pankaj will illustrate step by step that how we can club these aspects, how we can calculate consequences, different consequences in one unit. So you will get much more clarity by the end of the next session, I guess.
Surbi has a question. How could you, can you suggest measures for happiness or depression or stress? If my target population is under 15 years old, is the EQ5D sensitive for age? That's, I think, the one with Y can be used. And how old are the disability weights? How often are they revised? Yeah, I'm sure that they'll change with the changing times when the controls become better.
Yes, disability weights are updated after every GBD study.
Okay.
And the choice of selecting the appropriate instrument that captures happiness, or if you're, as you have suggested, that your target population is under 15 years of age, so it is really a difficult choice. First, you will have to identify what you want to do with your results. I will again reiterate that if you are doing this for the purpose of comparing two interventions, that which one offers best value for money, you should resort to EQ5D. However, if the aim is to produce some outputs for clinicians, there are a number of instruments, subject-specific instrument. If you remember the slide where we discussed some generic instrument and some disease-specific instrument, then I would suggest that you go with the disease-specific instrument. So a lot depends on what you are trying to do with the results of your study. Who is your audience of your results? So if clinicians are audience, then it will be better you use a disease-specific measure, because that is much more responsive than a generic measure.
Can you suggest some reading material? There's another question. reading material or PDF. So I think you should go to the website which he has
Yeah,
suggested.
it is there.
You'll find references to read. I think with that, we would like to wind up because we've reached the time limit. Thank you very much, Gaurav Jani, for an excellent presentation and a very useful one. So we expect to have you again sometimes. So we conclude this presentation and we pass on to the next one. And I'll request Dr. Harnoor to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Gaurav Jani, for such an informative talk. Now we move to the last session of the workshop to contemplate all we have learned during these 2 days for demonstration of the health economic analysis with the help of an example. For this, I would like to invite Mr. Pankaj Bahuguna, who is an economic evaluation specialist, HTA Regional Resource Center, PGIMER. I would request you to start the session, sir.
मैं जाऊंगी अभी मैं निकलूंगी थोड़ा I'll be online मैं उस पे कनेक्ट कर लेती हूँ What was the मैं भेजा हुआ ना
Hello.
Yes, good morning, sir.
Good morning. First of all, thank you so much, ma'am, Minu ma'am, to giving us the opportunity to deliver the talk on this platform. And
can see you. Can we see you?
Yeah, I am trying to
Okay.
on my video, but it is taking time a bit.
Okay. So welcome. It's always a pleasure to have you and all other members of your team here.
Yeah. Just a second, ma'am. Just give me a second to just switch on my video. Yeah.
What was the address? Northeast पे डाला हो. मैं करती होती हूँ कि I open it on my other phone. फिर एयरटेल का कनेक्शन बेटर काम करता है.
Ma'am, just give me a second. Let me connect again.
Yeah, please. Carry on. We can all have a 2 minutes break. This is a good time to thank. I'm really